The cabin was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that holds its breath. The kind that fills every corner not with rest, but with waiting. Colton Rayner hadn't spoken to another person in 47 days. He wasn't counting out of habit. He was counting because it mattered, because silence had become his companion, and if he ever broke it, he wanted to remember the reason why. His cabin sat nestled at the edge of Flathead National Forest, not far from Glacier Park, but far enough from people. Just a wood stove, an old deck with chipped railings, and a porch swing that didn't swing anymore. Out here, the only visitors were wind and weather. But Colton didn't mind. He'd chosen this, not as a retreat exactly, more like an agreement with life or with whatever was left of it. Each morning, he brewed coffee in the same tin pot, the bottom blackened by 1,000 fires. He split wood, not because he needed more, but because it kept his hands busy. He watched the trees like some men watch the road waiting for headlights that never come. There was a radio, unplugged, not broken, just unnecessary. Colton's boots were lined with pine needles. His dog had died 2 winters ago. He hadn't replaced her, not because he couldn't, because he didn't want to love something that couldn't grow old beside him. The truth is, Colton hadn't always lived like this. Once he'd been a husband, a father, a man who fixed things for a living, pipes wiring, leaky roofs, broken fences. He used to say that fixing gave him peace, but some things he couldn't fix. Not the fire that came too fast one August night. Not the hospital waiting room where no one looked him in the eyes. Not the way the front door of his old house still smelled like her shampoo long after the ashes cooled. He tried. He really tried. Stayed in town for a year. Went to one grief group. Never went back. In the end, he packed what he could carry, sold the rest, and followed the logging road until it stopped winding. That was 7 years ago. And silence. It had become less of a punishment and more of a balm. A place to lay grief down gently, like folding an old coat and leaving it on the porch. But even silence has edges. Even solitude, when stretched long enough, begins to echo back in ways that sound a lot like loneliness. He wouldn't say that out loud. Colton wasn't one for declarations or complaints, but he knew it. Felt it in the way he lingered by the window just a second longer than he used to. Heard it in the way his boots sounded loud, too loud against the porch planks. And some nights when the wind shifted just right, he'd find himself setting 2 plates on the table. Then quietly putting one away. Not because he forgot, because he remembered. Every Sunday, like clockwork, he sat on the porch with a notebook. Not to write, just to hold the pencil, just to let memory hover nearby. He'd open to the same page a letter he'd never finished. It began, "Hi, sweetheart. The snow's early this year. I keep the stove warm like you always wanted. I finally fixed the railing. I miss the way you used to hum when it snowed." That was as far as he got. Each week he read it, then closed it, folded the paper back like a secret he wasn't ready to say out loud. And maybe he never would. It's funny how grief doesn't just sit in your chest. It hides in coffee cups, in unused blankets, in songs that show up on the wind when you're not expecting them. And sometimes, it shows up in the form of paw prints. That morning, the frost clung to every branch like spun sugar. Colton was chopping wood sleeves, rolled breath rising in clouds. He paused when he noticed it. Tiny prints in the snow leading from the edge of the woods to his porch. Not deer, not fox. Too small, too delicate. He followed the tracks with his eyes. Up the porch steps, past the swing, straight to the door. They stopped there. Like something had come all the way to the threshold and waited. He bent down, pressing his hand next to the print. It was still warm. Some things don't arrive with thunder. Some things whisper, healing. If it ever comes, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come in sermons or lightning bolts. Sometimes it comes on 4 paws, thin legs, and a silence even deeper than your own. Colton looked toward the trees. They were still watching, just like him. He didn't know what waited out there, but something had come close enough to be seen, and that alone meant something had changed. If you've ever gone too long without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one was listening, then maybe you'll understand what Colton felt in that moment. Just breathe in and stay with us. Because what came next wasn't a sound. It was a choice. He left the door unlocked that night, not wide open, just unlocked, as if to say, if you need shelter, I'm here. Even if you don't knock. The first thing he noticed wasn't the sound. It was the stillness that came before it. That pause in the woods, the kind that happens when something wild decides to trust you, even for a breath. At dawn, the snow was thin and blue as breath. Colton stepped onto the porch, mug in hand, the coffee's steam curling up into the morning air. And there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing. A bobcat, lean, quiet, half shadow against the pale drift. Her fur was matted in places, the ribs faint beneath it. Her eyes were fixed not on him, but on the porch railing where crumbs from yesterday's bread had fallen. She wasn't afraid, just tired, the kind of tired that has no anger left in it. And around her neck, a collar, worn leather the color of old honey. The tag had a name scratched into it, almost gone with time. He squinted through the cold light, tracing the faint letters with his eyes. Echo. In Montana, you sometimes see a bobcat from a distance, a flash of muscle and grace gone before you can name it. They don't linger. They don't come close, not unless they have a reason. Colton knew that much. The collar, though, that was different. Wild bobcats don't wear names. He realized she must have been part of a wildlife rescue program, one of those released after rehabilitation. That explained the collar. It didn't explain the look in her eyes. That look said something else. Something like, I've been gone too long. He didn't move at first, didn't even breathe. He just stood there, watching her, watching him. Then, slow as the thaw, he lifted his hand not toward her, but toward the small tin bowl by the step. He filled it with water from his canteen, set it down, and stepped back inside. He left the door open. Through the thin crack, he watched her approach, one cautious step at a time. The kittens followed behind, two of them nearly invisible against the snow. They were nothing but fuzz and bones, more shadow than shape. One stumbled. The other mewed a soft, broken sound that seemed too small to survive the wind. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't some wild encounter. It was a cry for help, the kind he hadn't heard in years, the kind that leaves no room for thinking, only feeling. He went to the cupboard. Half a loaf of stale bread, a jar of dried fish, nothing much, but he broke it piece by piece into the bowl beside the water. When he came back to the window, the mother was gone. The kittens weren't. They were crouched beside the bowl, trembling with hunger, unsure if it was a gift or a trap. He whispered without meaning to. Go on. It's all right. The smaller one, Luna, though he didn't know her name yet, took the first bite. The other followed. Colton smiled barely. It wasn't joy. More like recognition. The kind of quiet understanding that passes between the broken and the brave. People say animals don't feel the way we do. Maybe they don't, but grief, it translates. In the wild, every creature understands loss. A mother separated from her young, a mate who doesn't come back, a den that collapses in a storm. Colton thought about that as he stood there in the doorway, his breath fogging the glass. He thought about what it means to come back to the last place that ever felt safe and to find someone still waiting. He didn't realize it yet, but that's what this was. A return. Hers, and in some strange way, his too. In that valley, the forest didn't just live, it listened. Every rustle had meaning. Every pause a heartbeat. The chickadees had gone quiet. The pine branches leaned heavy with frost. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Colton had read once that bobcats communicate in silence more than sound, in how they move, how they hold the world's gaze without flinching. And maybe that was the lesson, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to stay still enough for someone else to breathe again. By midday, the prints were gone. The wind had erased them like a secret it didn't want found. But Colton couldn't let it go. He gathered scraps of lumber and leaned them against the shed, something small, a makeshift shelter. Not because he thought she'd use it, because it felt wrong to do nothing. He left the door cracked that night, the wood stove warm, the bowl refilled. When he woke, the food was gone, and beside the empty bowl, paw prints again, tiny ones, and one larger set pressed deeper leading back to the trees. He smiled. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't hurt. Later that evening, he found himself whispering into the dark. "Echo," he said softly. It felt strange to speak the name, like calling to something half memory, half prayer. He didn't expect her to hear, didn't expect an answer. But somewhere out in the pines, he thought he heard a faint sound, a short, low cry, not fear, not anger, just presence. He sat for a long time after that, listening, not to the sound, but to what it stirred inside him. That name Echo fit her, because that's what she was. A reflection of everything he'd lost, returning now in a form he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. In small Montana towns, folks sometimes talk about signs, how the wild sends messages if you're quiet enough to notice. A fox crossing your path at dawn. An owl landing near the house right before a letter arrives. A deer stopping in the road and staring you down like it knows something you don't. Colton had never believed in that kind of thing. But that morning, looking at those tiny prints, he wondered, maybe some souls don't move on. Maybe they just change shape until we're ready to meet them again. He went back to his notebook that night, the one that still carried that unfinished letter. He opened it pencil in hand, and for the first time in 7 years he wrote something new. Something came by today. She looked hungry but proud. I don't know what she wants. Maybe she doesn't either. But I left food out anyway. I thought you'd like that. He didn't sign it, didn't need to. He just closed the book and left it by the window like a small offering to whatever kindness still lived in the world. When people lose everything, they often forget this truth, that life still knocks. Sometimes softly, sometimes in fur, sometimes wearing a collar with a name half worn away. And when it does, you have a choice. To turn away and keep the world quiet, or to open the door just enough for hope to slip back in. That's all healing ever asks, for a little space, a little warmth, a little faith that maybe, just maybe, love hasn't forgotten where you live. A week later, the snow turned heavy, the sky thick with gray. And when Colton stepped outside with his morning coffee, he found what he'd been hoping and fearing he might see. Echo was back. But this time she was limping. Her paw left small smears of red against the white. She looked up at him with that same steady gaze. Not begging, not warning, just asking. And in that moment, Colton Rayner, the man who hadn't spoken to another soul in 47 days, found himself whispering again. "Hold on," he said quietly. "I'll help you. If you've ever seen something wild and hurt something fragile trying to survive, you know that instinct. The one that says stay even when it hurts to look. So stay here with me, because what happens next is where love begins to remember itself." That night, as snow gathered against the porch steps, the bowl sat empty again, and Colton sat awake beside the fire, listening for the sound of her return. He didn't know it yet, but that faint whisper of paws in the dark was the beginning of everything. He didn't plan to care. That's how these things always start, not with grand decisions, but with small, ordinary kindnesses that refuse to be ignored. By the third morning, Colton had stopped pretending it was just coincidence. The bowl was always empty, the paw prints always fresh, and the sound of the forest, usually distant and polite, had changed. There was breathing now, waiting. Something out there trusted him enough to stay close. He noticed the difference before he understood it. The quiet wasn't hollow anymore. It had weight, like a heartbeat you can feel but can't name. Colton knew he should have let nature handle itself. That's what the ranger station always said, don't interfere. Let the wild stay wild. But hunger isn't an ecosystem. It's a language. And that morning, when he stepped outside and saw Echo limping again, her paw crusted with snow, the kittens pressed against her side, he stopped thinking about rules. He thought about need. He thought about his daughter's voice years ago saying, "Daddy, can we keep her just until she's better?" He thought about how he'd said no back then, because he'd been too practical to believe in mercy. He didn't want to make that mistake twice, so he built something. Behind the porch, he found old boards and leftover nails. Nothing fancy, nothing precise, just a lean-to enough to keep out the wind. He spread hay on the ground, then laid one of his flannel shirts over it. It smelled like wood smoke and loneliness. It was the best he had. When he finished, he stood back and felt ridiculous. It looked like a child's fort. But sometimes love begins as foolishness. That night, he warmed goat milk on the stove, thin and pale, the smell rising like memory. He poured it into a tin bowl, set it outside, and whispered, "Here you go, sweetheart, for the little ones." Then he went back inside and waited. Through the crack in the curtain, he saw her appear slow, careful, proud. She sniffed the air, tested the ground, then stepped into the light. The kittens followed cautious shadows at her heels. They drank like creatures who hadn't known kindness in a long while. When they finished, Echo looked toward the cabin, not with fear, not with gratitude exactly, but with a kind of understanding. Like two people meeting halfway across a bridge neither one planned to build. On the second night, snow started falling early, thick, heavy flakes that smothered every sound. Colton was at the stove stirring soup when he heard it a low mew near the porch door. He opened it to find one of the kittens. The smaller one, Luna, half buried in snow, shivering so hard she could barely stand. He didn't think. He just scooped her up and tucked her against his chest. Her heartbeat fluttered like a trapped bird. He set her near the stove, wrapped in a towel, and watched the rise and fall of her tiny ribs. For a moment, he was back in another kitchen. Another winter. Another small heartbeat in his arms, his daughter feverish, whispering, "Don't go back to work tonight, Daddy." Stay. He had gone, because back then he thought survival meant showing up for the job, not the people. Now he knew better. So he stayed. And when Luna's breathing slowed, when she blinked up at him with sleepy trust, he felt something move in his chest. Something old, something patient, something that had waited years for this exact night to begin again. Kindness rarely announces itself. It doesn't come with trumpets or grand speeches. It comes quietly in the way you pour milk for someone who can't ask for it, or how you build a shelter, knowing it might get torn down by morning. Love, Colton realized, is just a tension over time. A steady gaze, a steady hand. And though he'd spent years avoiding both, his body remembered how. It remembered gentleness. It remembered what it felt like to protect. And in that remembering, something thawed. The forest mirrored the change. In the following days, deer tracks crossed the yard again. Birdsong returned faint but brave. Even the creek behind the cabin, long frozen in its grief, began to sing under the ice. Colton spent his mornings chopping wood, his afternoons repairing the old barn. And each time he looked up, he'd see her Echo watching from the ridge. Not coming closer, not leaving either. That's how trust works. It grows like moss, quietly, patiently, without asking permission. By the end of that week, he had a rhythm. Milk at dawn, soup scraps at dusk, stories read aloud to the silence between them. Not children's stories this time, old ones. Fairy tales he'd found in a box years ago, tales of kindness and love and the loyalty of wild things. He didn't know why he read them aloud. Maybe for the sound of his own voice. Maybe because he believed stories heal what silence cannot. And maybe because he wanted the kittens to grow up hearing words that meant safe. The forest listened. Echo listened too. Some nights he swore he saw her eyes glowing near the tree line, steady as stars that refused to fade. Grief doesn't leave you empty. It leaves you open. It carves space where something gentle might return. Colton began to see that now. The more he gave the milk warmth voice, the less he felt like a ghost in his own home. He started talking out loud again, even when no one was there. Simple things. Morning, kids. Cold one today. Looks like snow again. And the funny thing was, it never sounded lonely. Not anymore. In a world that moves fast, people forget the power of slow care. We scroll, we rush. We forget that love can look like waiting beside a stove at 2 a.m. for a heartbeat to steady. But out there beneath the Montana sky, time worked differently. The clock didn't rule him. The forest did. And in the rhythm of feeding, mending, and watching, Colton found a truth he'd almost buried. That kindness, real kindness, isn't about rescue. It's about presence. Sometimes the best thing we can do for another soul, human or wild, is to stay close without trying to fix what's broken, to believe that warmth itself can teach healing. By the 10th day, Luna could walk again. She chased a falling leaf across the porch, pouncing clumsily, her tail flicking like joy itself. Her brother Scout followed bold and proud. Echo watched from the ridge, her paw still healing. Colton leaned against the door frame, coffee in hand, smiling at the sound, a sound he hadn't heard in years, laughter. Not his own, but close enough. It was the laughter of living things, and it filled the air like sunlight through frost. Some people think second chances are loud. A phone call, an apology, a miracle. But for Colton, it came on 4 paws and a bowl of milk. It came through the gentle nudge of a kitten's nose and the realization that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done offering love. It just needed a quieter way to say it. Then one afternoon, as he was splitting wood, he noticed the change. Echo hadn't come down that morning. The kittens waited longer than usual. The ridge was still, too still, and when he followed the tracks later, he found them ending near a patch of snow stained dark. Blood. Not much, but enough to pull the breath from his lungs. He followed the trail until dusk, calling her name into the wind. No answer, only the sound of the pines bending low, like the forest itself was holding its breath again. If you've ever cared for something wild, you know that love doesn't come with promises, only presence, only the hope that kindness might be enough. So stay with me, because what happens next is the part of the story where mercy meets fear and where both hearts, man and bobcat, learn what loyalty truly means. That night, as snow drifted against the window and the kittens slept in their flannel nest, Colton kept the lamp burning late. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a life he'd come to care about was fighting to stay. And this time he wouldn't look away. He stood in the doorway with a towel in his hands and a choice in his throat: walk away as he'd learned to do, or bend down and touch a wound that belonged to the wild. The wind had a way of telling the truth in that valley. It didn't shout. It carried small things, smoke, the scent of wet earth, the hush of distant water. That evening it carried the sound of something collapsing, a soft breaking sound that pooled in Colton's chest the way frost pools in hollows. When he followed the prints, they led him to a small gully, half hidden by young spruce. Snow clung to the branches like fringe. The light was thin, late, almost ashamed that it had to be out at all. There she lay, Echo, her shoulder pressed to the snow, breathing shallow and fast. Her coat was dusted with a dark that hadn't been there before. A wound near the leg bled slowly, a stubborn, patient leak. She watched him stand over her without flinching. She had stopped flinching some time ago. Colton felt the old rules press against his skin. Don't interfere. Let the wild stay wild. He also felt a different instruction, older and more urgent. If you can help, do it. He folded his towel, warmed his hands on the stove, and knelt in the snow. Colton wasn't a vet. He was a man who'd fixed things, pipes that refused to flow, roofs that let rain remember its name. He knew enough to stop bleeding, to wrap, to keep the wound clean. That was enough now. That had to be enough. He heated water in a kettle until it sang. He soaked a rag and pressed it gently to the wound, listening to Echo's breath. She didn't fight. She let him. When he worked, his motions were slow and precise. The same hands that had once held his daughter's fevered forehead now held a wild animal's paw. He disinfected the tear with care, threaded a needle with a practiced, shaky patience, and began to stitch. Not for pride, not for heroism, for something quieter, a promise. Promises are small things stitched into days. They are not always the big declarations we imagine. Often they are the steady, unremarked acts that say, "I will be here." That was what he was doing now, keeping the kind of promise he'd failed to keep before. As his fingers moved the stitches, reminding him of rhythm, Pierce pulled not, his mind wandered not to blame or to fury, but to a single ordinary afternoon from another life. A hospital corridor, fluorescent and too bright. A nurse wheeling a cart past the doorway. He remembered the thin blue bracelet they'd put on his daughter's wrist, the way her small hand fit inside his, the way the world narrowed until all that remained was the beeping of a monitor. He had promised in the hurry of grief to be the kind of man who never left. Instead, he had gone back to work, to the noise of other people's problems. Thinking work would keep him steady, he told himself that steadiness was a kind of kindness. The memory was not a judgment, so much as a ledger entry, one promise, unpaid. The stitch in Echo's leg was a small repayment, one that didn't fix the past, but it made the present true. Everyone bears a map of scars. Some are skin deep, others sit just under the ribs. Colton's had been carved in silence and small absences. Echo's would be marked on fur and memory. But scars of different kinds tell similar stories, that something brave once lived there, that something once tried to heal. There is a strange loyalty in these moments. Not the loud kind that shows up on flags or banners, but the quiet kind, the kind that keeps you overnight when the storm is loud and the world asks you to leave. Colton learned then that loyalty could be a bowl of warmed milk, a hand that steadies a trembling body, a door left unlocked. He pressed his palm to Echo's flank after the last knot, feeling the warmth beneath the fur. She twitched her ears, then settled. He didn't expect gratitude in the human sense. Wild things show their thanks differently, by trusting you to be there when morning comes, by returning to the same porch step for another bowl. Most people think saving a life is a one-sided transaction. You give food, shelter, care. The rescued life is the receiver. But sometimes healing is an exchange. Colton found that as he worked, he gave stitches and shelter, and the forest returned his voice. He gave patience, and the kittens taught him how to laugh at small things again. He mended fur, and it mended something under his ribs that had been waiting for permission to soften. There's a moral in stories like this, not a lecture, but a quiet offering. It is not only about kindness for its own sake. Kindness becomes a kind of mirror when you show it. You tend to see what you have left to care for in yourself. This is not redemption in a dramatic sense. It is the gentle, soulful restoration of someone who had been surviving but not living. That night, Colton kept watch. The stove's embers rolled like tiny moons, and the kittens sometimes stirred in their hay, tiny bodies unfolded by warmth. He'd rigged a soft loop to keep Echo from putting weight on the wound, a makeshift sling fashioned from an old scarf. Her breath evened out. At one point, Luna, no longer so small, now poked a paw at his boot, then nosed his hand. He laughed aloud, a small surprised sound that startled the room into light. It was easy to think of that laugh as unimportant, but it was not. It was another stitch. Outside, the forest exhaled. Somewhere up on the ridge, a hawk called a sound that cut clean and honest through the dark. He thought of how the wild is full of moral stories not told in words, but in decisions, a doe that returns to her fawn, a raven that brings food to a hungry fox. The world keeps teaching if you let it. He knew the risk. Tagged animals are tracked. Agencies send men in trucks with clipboards and rules. Echo's collar wasn't just a name, it was a record. He had seen that bureaucratic efficiency in town, a neatness that made decisions about life and death in ink and signature. He had avoided it because systems had once let him down. But the fear of being found was smaller than the fear of standing aside. That night he chose the risk of care over the security of isolation. He thought too about promises made to people and promises left unsigned. In that one small patch of clearing under a lamp's sickly light, he was signing something else, the promise of presence. Not the loud, performative kinds, just the patient kind that stays when storms come. On the third day, Echo was stronger. She limped, but she could put weight on the leg. Scout chased a moth across the porch. Luna slept on Colton's boot. The rhythm of days had returned. Milk watch, mend, repeat. Then late in the afternoon, the truck came. It was not the slow, friendly pickup of a neighbor. It was practical white, with a logo on the door, State Wildlife and Recovery. Two men stepped out, their jackets zipped against the wind, not unkind, but certain. They asked questions about a tagged bobcat, about a report, about the legality of harboring a wild animal. They spoke in the language of rules and liability, the language that has saved some lives and ended others. Colton answered as he had, to honest, guarded, careful. He let them see the bowl, the blanket, the sling. He let them hear Echo's breathing in the dark. But in their eyes he saw another ledger, a list of procedures that left no room for the messy, soulful complications of care. He understood then that the world had more than one kind of law. There was the law on paper, and there was the law of the porch. The ethic that says you do what you can when someone arrives at your door with nowhere to go. If you've ever mended something broken, an old chair, a frayed friendship, a wound, then you know how small acts add up. Hold that thought. And if you've ever been afraid to show up because rules told you not to whisper this, instead, kindness is not lawless. It's essential. Stay with me, because what happens next asks him to choose between the tidy safety of rules and the messy, heartwarming truth of loyalty. Colton looked at the men on the porch. He smelled their coffee-stained work jackets and the certainty in their questions. Then he looked at Echo, sleeping with one eye half open, as if to keep one foot in the world and one foot in the dream. He rose, wiped his hands on his jeans, and in a voice that felt steadier than he'd expected, he said, "She's not causing harm. She's healing." It was not a defiant shout. It was a soft, resolved note like the last stitch pulled tight. And that was enough to start the next part of the story. It wasn't a fight, no yelling, no slamming doors, just a quiet moment when two different kinds of truths stood face to face and waited for one to step back. The men from the State Wildlife and Recovery Unit didn't come with guns. They came with clipboards, regulation boots, and polite authority. The kind that wears concern like a badge, but never quite knows what to do with kindness once it crosses into the gray. They stood on Colton's porch, glancing toward the shed where Echo rested her stitched leg wrapped in one of his daughter's old scarves. The taller man, Ranger Morris, nodded toward the collar. "Tracked her from 3 miles north. Collar pinged yesterday. She's not supposed to be this far into human proximity." Colton kept his voice even. "She came to me injured. Starving. She had 2 kittens with her. I didn't bring her here. She came on her own." That maybe the other added, tapping his form, but as you know, once an animal in the state rehabilitation program is released, if it reapproaches residential property, it becomes a liability. We're obligated to evaluate her for recapture. He said the words gently, like a man offering directions to someone who didn't ask. Colton just looked down at his hands, the scar on his knuckle from that first night she'd let him tend her paw. "She's not mine," he said slowly, "but she's not yours either." The dilemma was simple on paper, complicated in practice. Echo had been part of a failed soft release program, rescued as a young adult, collar tagged and reintroduced into the wild. But she hadn't stayed wild, not fully. She'd lingered at the edges of homes, scavenged, quietly refused to disappear the way the agency hoped. Animals like that, they explained, blur the lines. They confuse humans, they lose their fear. And a wild animal without fear of people, that's what the paperwork calls a problem. Even if she'd never harmed anyone, even if she came limping, starving, carrying nothing but 2 half-grown kittens and a heart still loyal to what once helped her. Rules don't measure loyalty. They measure risk. The men gave Colton an option. They'd take Echo to a secondary holding facility where she'd be observed, evaluated. If she proved unable to reacclimate, she'd be peacefully retired. Colton asked what that meant. They didn't answer. Instead, one of them leaned in and said softly, "You've done a good thing, sir. Truly. But it's time we take it from here." He nodded like it was mercy. But to Colton, it felt like surrender. He thought of the way Echo had placed herself between the kittens and the wind, the way she had let him stitch her leg, her breath trembling but her body still, the way she had looked at him not like a pet, not like prey, but like someone who knew the weight of being left behind. He stepped back from the porch, opened the shed door. Echo was there, alert but resting. The kittens stirred in the hay. Colton turned to the rangers. "If you want her," he said quietly, "you'll have to take her in front of them. There's a difference between ownership and guardianship." Colton never once thought of Echo as his. She was her own wild truth, untamed, resilient, soulful, in ways he would never fully understand. But he had cared for her. He had opened a door, shared warmth, stayed through long, quiet nights when she couldn't walk. That meant something. It had to. Protecting isn't always about possession. Sometimes it's just a promise you keep in your actions, feeding, sheltering, showing up. And sometimes protection means standing in the way, even if your voice shakes. The trouble with rules is they don't always leave space for exceptions with names. Colton understood the law's intent safety order, a way to prevent harm before it started. But what happens when safety becomes a reason to erase a relationship that's real? He didn't blame the men. They weren't villains. They were doing what they were told, following pages filled with checkboxes and measured risk. But Echo wasn't a checkbox. She was a mother who had survived winter, a creature who had chosen trust again and again despite what the world had taught her. He looked them in the eyes and said the quiet truth that had been growing in him for weeks. She came here because something broke. She stayed because something healed. Maybe it was the steadiness in his voice. Maybe it was the kittens now peeking from behind the stacked woodpile. Maybe it was the weariness on his face, like a man who'd built something with his hands and knew what it would cost to see it undone. Whatever it was, the rangers paused. Morris glanced at his partner, then back at Colton. 30 days, he said. We document her progress. You provide reports, photos, behavior logs. If she reintegrates properly, Hunts avoids humans will reconsider. And the kittens. Colton asked. They stay with you, he replied, until further notice. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't loss either. It was time. Time to show that healing could happen outside of protocols. That sometimes kindness wasn't a risk, it was the only real solution. After they left, Colton didn't celebrate. He just sat on the porch step, the winter sun sliding across the yard in slow streaks. Echo limped out slow but steady and lay beside the kittens. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Some understandings don't need eye contact. Colton thought about how years ago he'd failed to make the right choice when it mattered most, how he'd let fear and practicality pull him away from someone who had needed him. This time, he hadn't run. He had stayed. And in doing so, maybe he had finally forgiven himself, not all the way, but enough. All across America, people open their homes to wounded things, stray cats, broken dogs, sometimes even people. They do it quietly without headlines. In small cabins, on back porches, through bowls of milk and long silences that become something more. This story wasn't just about a bobcat. It was about what happens when a man broken by loss decides that maybe kindness is worth trying again. It's about the way animals meet us exactly where we are, not demanding more, just offering their presence as a mirror. And sometimes that's enough to bring us back to ourselves. That night, Colton took the collar from Echo's neck just long enough to clean it, mend the frayed edges, and read the faded inscription again. He traced the letters with his thumb. Echo. Then, almost without thinking, he took an old silver tag from his toolbox, one that had belonged to his dog years ago. He etched a second name onto it, Luna, attached it beside the first. 2 names, 2 stories, 1 family. He hung it above the porch where the wind could move through it. The soft chime it made didn't sound like bells. It sounded like memory, like the forest breathing. If you've ever been asked to choose between following the rules and following your heart, you know how heavy that silence can be. If you've ever stood between comfort and compassion, between retreat and reaching out, then maybe you know what it means to choose someone who doesn't even speak your language, but understands your soul. Take a moment. Think of a time you said yes to care, even when it wasn't easy, especially then. 30 days, that's what they gave him. But as Colton watched Echo curl beside the kittens and heard the wind rustle through pine and snow, he knew this wasn't about deadlines. It was about what happens when you stay long enough to become real again to someone else and to yourself. Healing doesn't arrive like thunder. It comes quietly in the slow rhythm of shared mornings, in the way silence stops feeling empty and starts to sound like home. The ranger's truck had left a trail of dust that hung in the air long after the sound of its engine faded. 30 days. That's what they gave him. Colton stood on the porch as the valley breathed its slow exhale. The wind brushed against the tin tag he'd hung from the roof beam, Echo and Luna chiming together in the gentlest duet. The rules were clear. Document her progress, track her behavior, record her return to the wild. But what the men couldn't put on paper was what really needed healing. Not just a bobcat, not just a man, but the quiet space between them, the fragile thread that had learned to hold life again. So he began, not with notes or checklists, but with the oldest act of faith there is. He showed up every day. Each morning began the same. He'd brew coffee, pour milk for the kittens, and watch the frost melt from the porch rail. Echo would emerge from the shed, her limp softening her eyes, still watchful but no longer wary. The kittens Scout and Luna grew braver, tumbling through the grass, chasing sunlight, as if it might vanish if they didn't hold it first. Colton kept track of everything, not with numbers, but with noticing. How Echo's coat thickened again, how she began hunting near the stream, how by the 10th day she no longer flinched when the wind rattled the windows. The wild, it seemed, was learning to trust itself again, and so was he. One afternoon he set out to repair the barn roof, a task he'd been avoiding since winter began. He carried nails, a hammer, and the steady patience of someone who'd run out of excuses. While he worked, the kittens played in the hay below. Echo lingered nearby, her gaze steady but calm. Every so often she'd tilt her head upward, following the rhythm of the hammer. Each strike echoed through the valley, a small heartbeat returning to the land. He thought of his daughter then, how she once sat on that same porch painting small wooden birds he'd carved for her. He remembered how her laughter had filled the air like spring water. For a long time he couldn't think of that sound without it hurting. But now he realized that pain and joy had always shared the same language. He drove the last nail, leaned back and smiled. The roof was steady. The kittens were sleeping. Echo was cleaning her paw in the sunlight. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was patching something broken. He felt like he was building something new. Sometimes we think love is a single act, a grand rescue, a sacrifice. A moment we can point to and say that's when everything changed. But it isn't. It's repetition. It's the daily choice to keep showing up even when no one's watching. For Colton, those 30 days weren't about saving Echo. They were about remembering how to live with gentleness again. The forest, too, began to soften. He started hearing more life at night, the yip of a fox, the low hum of owls. Even the creek seemed to hum with contentment. Nature has a way of forgiving in silence. It doesn't hold grudges, it just waits for you to come back. The rangers had called it a probation period, but to Colton it felt more like a lesson in becoming real. He remembered a story his wife once read aloud from an old book about a toy rabbit who longed to become real through the love of a child. It wasn't the rabbit's fur or his buttons that made him real, it was the loving, the choosing, the staying. That story came back to him as he watched Echo rest beneath the birch trees. Her scars didn't make her less wild, they made her honest. Every creature, man or animal, carries the story of survival in the lines of its body. And every scar, visible or not, is proof that love has touched you even if it hurt. That's what real means. Not perfect, just true. By the 3rd week, Colton had filled pages of his notebook. He drew sketches of paw prints. He jotted down the weather, the hunts, the playful leaps of the kittens. But between the lines, the journal became something else entirely, a record of gratitude. When Ranger Morris returned for a mid-check, he found Colton on the porch reading aloud. It wasn't a report, it was a letter. "She's learned to fish again," he read. "She doesn't linger by the door anymore. When she runs, the kittens follow. I think she remembers what freedom tastes like. I think I do too." The ranger didn't speak for a moment. He just nodded, eyes soft. "You're doing more than keeping her alive," he said quietly. "You're reminding her what she's for." After he left, Colton stood there for a long time, his throat tight. the sky deepening into gold. He looked at Echo and thought, maybe she's reminding me too. Evenings came slower now. Colton would sit by the fire, the kittens curled near the stove, the sound of their purring blending with the crackle of the wood. Echo often stayed near the doorway, half in, half out, a creature caught between two worlds, but at peace with both. He found comfort in her in-betweenness. She didn't belong to captivity or wilderness alone. She belonged to the thin place between them, the space where care and freedom could coexist. Maybe that's what healing truly is. Not returning to what we were, but finding peace in what we've become. In the forest, everything heals by rhythm. The frost yields to thaw. The river clears its own debris, and even the trees mend their wounds with rings that tell the truth of every hard season. Watching Echo, Colton began to understand that humans aren't separate from that rhythm. We just forget to listen. We think healing means erasing pain, but the forest shows us it means carrying it differently. It means making space for new growth to rise around what was hurt. He looked at Echo's limp, now barely visible, and thought, that's what forgiveness looks like when it walks. By the 30th day, the valley was full of light. The snow had receded and the creek ran fast again. That morning, Echo didn't come to the porch. Neither did the kittens. He waited, the coffee cooling in his hands, his pulse a little quicker than he wanted to admit. He walked to the ridge where she often hunted. There, beneath the tall pine, he found only tracks, 3 sets leading toward the tree line. Her collar lay near the edge of the stream, damp and clean as if she'd taken it off herself. Colton picked it up, thumb brushing the metal tag. The wind stirred through the valley, carrying a sound that might have been bird song or maybe memory. He didn't cry. He smiled, small, quiet, the way you do when something hurts but feels right. Some loves are meant to stay. Others are meant to teach you how to let go. If you've ever loved something enough to let it return to where it belongs, you know the strange peace that follows. It doesn't mean the story ends. It means it becomes part of the landscape. Take a breath and think of the moments that changed you quietly, not with fireworks, but with gentleness. Because sometimes that's all healing is, the courage to love again and the grace to release what love restores. Colton carried the collar back to the cabin and hung it beside the door. The kitten's bowls sat untouched. The wind chime whispered both names, Echo and Luna, softly like a prayer. That night when he went to sleep, the house didn't feel empty. It felt alive. And in the space between his heartbeat and the quiet outside, something stirred, a sound half memory, half miracle, the sound of life continuing. He thought he'd known goodbye. But some farewells don't come in words. They come in paw prints, a collar left behind, and the sound of nothing where something sacred used to be. The collar sat on the table for hours before he could touch it. It was still damp from the creek, curled slightly like a sleeping thing. The tag shimmered in the window light, 2 names etched into the metal, soft as breath. Echo, Luna. A tag that once meant she's being watched now meant something else entirely. It meant she had gone. On her own terms, which is exactly how it had to be. Still, the silence in the cabin that morning felt different. Not hollow, just full of her absence. Colton had spent years believing that grief was the sound of something being ripped away, loud, sudden, unfair. But this was quieter. This was the grief of something complete. Echo hadn't disappeared. She'd returned to the wild. He'd watched her find her feet again, watched her teach her kittens to climb, to hunt, to listen. She hadn't been taken. She had chosen. And there in that choice was the deepest kind of trust. I don't need you now, but I'll never forget that you stayed. He traced the tag with his thumb, the cool metal grounding him. For the first time in a long while he wept. Not from pain, but from a fullness that had nowhere else to go. Later that afternoon, he found himself walking along the edge of the stream. The same one where he'd first seen her tracks, the same place her collar had been left. It was spring now. The melt had come early, filling the water with soft, urgent movement. Bird song echoed between the trees, low, patient, like a hymn. As he walked, he thought of his daughter. He saw her again as she once had been, kneeling by the stream in her yellow rain boots, holding out a hand to a frog with the seriousness only children carry. "Be gentle, Daddy," she'd said once, lifting a worm from the soil to save it from the shovel. "They're just trying to be alive like us." That memory rose now like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. It didn't burn. It warmed. He knelt at the stream bank, letting the water run over his fingers, the current tugging at his hand like a small, invisible creature. Everything wants to move forward, he thought. Even me. Love doesn't always ask to be held. Sometimes it asks to be released, and that might be the truest kind. Colton understood at last that healing isn't always about restoring what was lost. Sometimes it's about allowing yourself to be changed by what chose to stay even for a little while. Echo had come to him broken, but she hadn't left as someone who needed saving. She left as someone who remembered. And in the space where she'd been on the porch in the shed near the fire, something sacred remained. Not just her memory, but the man she'd helped him become. We think we're the caretakers, that it's our job to save animals, to protect the wild, and yes, sometimes that's true. But often they're the ones who do the saving. Echo had taught him more than any sermon ever could. She didn't speak. She didn't demand. She simply arrived, stayed as long as she needed, and left when it was time. And in her leaving, she left him something he hadn't known he still needed: permission. Permission to feel again. To build again. To carry the softness of love in a world that often insists on hardness. That evening, Colton lit the old oil lamp. Not because he needed the light, but because it was what he used to do when the house felt too quiet. He set the collar on a small hook above the hearth. Next to it, he placed the carved wooden rabbit his daughter had once painted sky blue. Two relics of love. One human, one wild. Both real. He made tea, pulled a blanket around his shoulders, and sat. Not waiting, just being. Sometimes that's enough. There's a soft transition in grief that doesn't come with fanfare. One day the ache turns gentle. The memories stop ambushing you. The silence becomes a companion, not a punishment. That's when you know something has shifted. Not erased, just transformed. Colton felt that shift now. He no longer listened for her pause on the porch. He no longer scanned the tree line for her shadow. He simply carried her with him. In the way he poured the milk, in the way he spoke to the trees, in the way he now answered when the wind called. Everyone loses something. A pet, a partner, a parent, a place you thought you'd always call home. But not everyone gets a chance to say goodbye in the shape of new love. That's what Echo gave him. She didn't replace what he had lost. She reminded him that he still had the capacity to care. To choose love again, to be kind, even when no one was watching. That kind of lesson doesn't fade. It becomes part of you. Like a scar, like a song, like a name whispered in the quiet. The next morning, Colton rose before dawn. He made coffee, opened the windows, and stood in the doorway listening. He didn't expect her to return. He didn't need her to, but something in him hoped the kittens might come back someday just to show him how tall they'd grown. He looked out across the trees, then down at the porch rail where frost still kissed the wood. There, small but certain, were fresh paw prints. 2 sets, side by side. He didn't call out. He didn't move. He just smiled, eyes brimming, and whispered the only words that mattered. Welcome home. If only for a minute. If you've ever let go of something you loved and later found that it never really left you, not in the ways that matter, then maybe you understand. Not every goodbye is an ending. Sometimes it's an opening, so take a breath. And remember the collar, the paw prints, the way something wild found you in your quiet and stayed, long enough to help you remember who you still were. That night, Colton lit the lamp again. The wind stirred the tags by the door. Echo, Luna. 2 small notes in a song that hadn't ended. And as he sipped his tea and looked out over the land that had raised him and then held him, he knew the story wasn't over. It was simply ready to be shared, with someone else who needed to believe that kindness still has a place, and that love, even the kind without words, always finds its way back. It started with a bowl of milk, a limping bobcat, 2 half-starved kittens, and a man who thought he had nothing left to give. But healing it, turns out, doesn't wait for us to be ready. It just asks us to stay. Spring passed gently into summer in the Montana Valley. The mornings came earlier now, threaded with bird song and soft light, and the air no longer carried the bite of snow. In that quiet rhythm of changing seasons, Colton Rayner did something he never thought he would again. He built something that lasted. Not a structure, not a barn or fence, but a life. The 30 days he was given came and went. No one from the agency returned. No clipboard, no truck, no judgment. And maybe that was the real sign that things had changed, not just in Echo, not just in the land, but in him. Colton stayed. Not because he had to, but because someone had stayed for him first. He kept the porch swept, left a small pile of fish near the wood line once a week just in case. Hung the collar where the wind could find it, where it caught the light like a tiny memory. The kittens grown now came and went with the freedom of youth. Luna. The small one always returned first. Scout sometimes stayed away longer, but never too long. They didn't need his milk anymore, but they still returned for the rhythm. The presence, the sense that someone waited for them. And Colton. He no longer counted days in silence. He measured them in small, soulful things, the way sunlight filtered through pine, the distant rustle of paws at dusk, the weight of a warm mug in his hands while the house filled with the scent of bread baking again. Things he used to do for a family he lost, now returned in new form, a wild, beautiful form. One afternoon, a local teacher came by. She asked if he'd be willing to speak to her class, just a short visit. Talk about wildlife. Maybe tell the kids about the bobcat. At first, he said no. The thought of standing in front of people again felt like trying to lift something he wasn't strong enough to carry. But that night, as he sat by the fire with Luna curled near the porch rail, he heard her purring low and steady like she was humming the story herself. So he said yes. He didn't bring notes. Just a photograph, the only one he had. A blurry shot of Echo by the stream, her kittens behind her, wild and alert. He told the children about trust, about kindness, about how wild animals don't give their loyalty easily, but when they do, it changes you. About how Echo had come to him in the winter, not asking for rescue, only for enough warmth to carry her through. He told them simply and truthfully that love doesn't always look like fairy tales. Sometimes it looks like silence shared, like staying up all night by a stove, like opening your door to something with claws and fear in its eyes. And staying. After he finished, one of the kids raised her hand and said, "That's like a real-life bedtime story." Colton smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "It kind of is. Staying is hard. It asks more of us than running ever will. To stay means to witness, to sit with the slow ache of healing, to choose loyalty over comfort even when no one else sees it. That's the heart of all truly moral stories, not in the victories, but in the quiet in-between moments when someone chooses to love without expecting anything in return. That's what makes them soul deep, what turns them from fiction into something true. Echo didn't teach Colton to be brave. He'd already been that once in the fires and the rescues. What she taught him was softer and harder. She taught him to be tender again, to be kind, to hold grief with open hands, not closed fists. He stopped asking why things happen and started asking, what can I do with the time that's left? In a world that praises speed, efficiency, success, staying is its own kind of miracle. To slow down long enough to listen to yourself, to the forest, to a frightened bobcat, that's a kind of wisdom we've forgotten how to honor. But the natural world remembers. It never rushes the seasons. It never forces a bloom before its time. And it always offers a second chance to those willing to notice. Echo's return to the wild wasn't just survival, it was grace. Her leaving didn't end the story. It deepened it. Because love, when it's real, doesn't fade when someone walks away. It lingers. In the routine. In the porch, Swing Creek. In the fresh fish set out on Wednesdays. In a man who, after losing everything, found his way back by caring for something wild. One evening near summer's end, Colton stood on the porch. No wind that night, just stillness, soft and expectant. The stars had come early, scattering themselves across the dark like promises. He held his mug close, breathed in the pine, and listened. Then, from the edge of the clearing, movement. Not fast, not dramatic, just a shape. 4 paws, a familiar silence, and 2 golden eyes catching the moonlight like a story returning. Echo. She didn't come closer. She didn't need to. They both knew what had been shared, what had been built, what had stayed. And as she disappeared again into the trees, Colton whispered one word: happy. Not as a wish, as a truth. If this story touched something in you, even just a little pause, sit with it. Ask yourself, what have I left the door open for lately? What have I stayed for? Even when it hurt, and more than that, what small kindness could I offer today? Even if no one else will see it but me. If you believe stories like this matter, soulful, quiet, heartwarming stories that remind us of the bond between people and animals, between grief and growth, between loss and love, then I'd love for you to join us. Click like to let this story live on. Subscribe for more inspirational stories about loyalty, healing, and the unexpected beauty of the natural world. And if you feel moved to help, there's a way to go further. Tap Super Thanks or donate below. Your gift helps us tell more stories and helps real organizations that rescue and care for animals. Like Echo, wild ones who just need a little time, a little space, and someone who chooses to stay. Together, we can be part of something bigger, not by shouting louder, but by listening deeper. The wind picked up again as he stepped back inside. The tags above the door whispered their gentle song, Echo Luna. A story, yes, but more than that. A promise to keep the door open, to stay soft, to choose love, even when no one's watching, especially then.